Okay, here we go. This is one of those episodes that I've been both looking forward to and kind of dreading because this is one of those episodes. It's probably going to make some people mad. There will certainly will be some of you who disagree with me, and there on the other side there'll be some people going, "Oh, finally somebody's admitting this, and somebody's saying this, and somebody's dealing with this." What's the this? We'll get into it in a moment. Uh, I want to start by saying I'm not trying to be divisive and I'm not trying to evade any kinds of answers. I'm trying to present both sides accurately. There are going to be several I don't knows in this episode because I don't know. And bottom line is, nobody really knows. We're all trying to come up with our best answers that we can. There's maybe no other place in the Bible that pushes the limits of one of our foundational premises for this series than this passage does. And that foundational premise is good science and good theology are good friends. There may be no other place, including Noah's Ark, where those two come into. I was going to want to say conflict, but not a conflict. Yeah, well, okay. They come into conflict with each other. They seem to be in conflict with each other. That's the best way to phrase it. But we're going to get into it. What we're going to be taking a look at today is the first 5 days of creation. Um, we'll get into day 6 next time. In fact, we'll get into day 6 the next 2 times because the creation of mankind is listed twice in Genesis, and it is so fundamental to our understanding of God and ourselves and our relationship with Him and our relationship with each other and our relationship with the entirety of creation. So the next 2 are pivotal as well. But this episode today, the first 5 days of creation, is an interesting, wonderful passage. I look forward to studying it every time. But again, there's also a sense of kind of being overwhelmed by it because the subject is big. It is really hard to understand. I don't have all of it by any stretch of the imagination. I keep trying to learn. And so at this point, I'm going to give you what I've learned as best I've learned it. And if there's something I don't know, I'll tell you that I don't know. So we're going to go through the days of creation one day at a time. We're going to do it in a question and answer format. It just seems to be the best way to work through this, where we basically are acknowledging some of the hard questions and trying to answer them as best we can. So let's go through it day at a time, beginning with day 1. We're going to look at Genesis 1, verses 2 through 23, but let's actually start by reading it from verse 1 so we have the entire thing in context. So Genesis 1, beginning with verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's what we've spent the last couple episodes on. Today, we'll start to get into verse 2. Now, the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. God saw that the light was good, and He separated the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness He called night. And there was evening and there was morning, the first day. Okay, there's enough in there to keep good Christians and good theologians arguing literally until we're in heaven again, and hopefully maybe then we'll get an understanding of it. So let's take a look at it in a Q&A format. First question, and there's going to be several things about this you're going to look at it and go, well, he didn't acknowledge that. You're right. I can't answer everything. It would be literally hours and hours and hours of study just on this one chapter if we were to try to tackle everything in it. So we just can't, but we'll give it a best shot to hit some of the key moments anyway. Okay, so here's the first question. Were the days of creation 24-hour days or something else? Now, the very presence of that question causes some Christians to get frustrated. They'll go, well, a day is just a day, right? Yes, but no. The Bible uses the word day in several different manners. The Bible uses the word day as a 24-hour day sometimes. It uses the day in different ways at different times, and we'll get into what some of those are later. But just suffice to say, it is a valid question to ask because it is not really clear what kind of day we're meaning here. There's a group of Christians, and many of you may be included in that, who believe that it has to be a 24-hour day in order for the rest of the Bible to make sense and to come together. I don't think it has to be that. I understand the arguments for that, I think. I appreciate the arguments for that because it comes from a desire to honor and understand God's word and to take it at its face value, which I have an absolute appreciation for. But as I've studied this, the idea that the days of creation have to be 24-hour days is a really recent phenomenon in the church. Very, very few Christian theologians were making a case for that up until the last 150 years or so. Why? What happened in the last 150 years or so? Well, Darwin happened in the last 150 years or so. And when Charles Darwin came along and proposed his theory of evolution, and that has now become the launching point for all of scientific method about origins of the universe. Um, because of that, churches looked at it and went, we have to come up with our own alternative. And that was when the 24-hour day for creation became a big pushing point, because it was a pushback against macroevolution, which we talked about an episode or so ago. That is not a wrong thing to do. Often things will come up within our understanding of science or culture or sociology or whatever, or ethics or sexuality, and we'll look at it and go, oh, what does the Bible have to say about that? We hadn't had to think about it in that way before. So it's not wrong to look at something that's come up in the culture and in science and go, hey, how does the Bible address that? That's not wrong. All I'm saying is, until that happened, the 24-hour day was not a big issue among most Christian theologians. In fact, the idea that the day in the creation story was not a 24-hour day was not first proposed like in recent methodology by people who wanted to be friends with evolutionaries. It actually began as early as the early 400s AD with Saint Augustine. We heard about him before, right? We just recently talked about Saint Augustine, or Augustine, depending on how you want to pronounce it. Saint Augustine in the early 400s AD was the first one to propose that both the physical world and time itself were creations of God. That has been proven true by science, and we look at it and go, yeah, and it matches the biblical record. Saint Augustine, a great Christian thinker, was also the first one to propose that these days may not be 24-hour days, they may be eras. They may be a particular, an indeterminate span of time. There's a great scientist, one of the greatest living scientists today, and he's not all that well known like an Einstein or a Hawking. His name is Francis Collins. He's still alive. And Francis Collins' great work is one of the great works of all humankind. In the 90s, he was given the assignment during the Clinton administration. He was given the assignment by the federal government to see if he could begin the process of mapping out human DNA, which is so long and so complex that no scientist believed that it could be done within Francis Collins's lifetime, or even a couple lifetimes. The mapping and understanding of our DNA is so large and so complex, no scientist thought it would get done in their lifetime. But Collins pulled together a group of scientists from around the world and got them working on it to such a degree, and was so good at doing it that within a handful of years it was done. And the reason you can now go to these DNA sites and get your DNA read and discover, hey, I'm 23% this and 27% this, is because of Francis Collins and his project. It is widely considered to be one of the greatest feats of science of the late 20th and early 21st century. I say all of that because Francis Collins is a profoundly dedicated Christian. And here is this man who is one of the greatest scientific minds of our time. He is a Christian. And his quote about this idea of, is it a 24-hour day? How does evolution fit into it? He believes the Genesis record. He says, quote, what kind of days these were is extremely difficult, perhaps impossible for us to conceive. So much smarter minds than mine are looking at this, and they are coming from a very biblical literate standpoint plus a scientifically literate standpoint. And they're going, we just don't know what kind of 24-hour days these were. And secondary to me, it doesn't really matter if they're 24-hour days or not, because the order of them is what's more important. So all of that to say this is a subject on which good Christians disagree. So if you're hearing me right now and you're just rolling your eyes at me and going, he doesn't even know what he's talking about, okay, fine. I probably don't. This is my best understanding. This is me trying to figure it out. I'm trying to follow Jesus as best I can. You're trying to follow Jesus as best you can. And a whole lot of very good Christians are going to disagree on this. It's one of those things where I think we need to learn to disagree more agreeably than we typically do on this. Like I say, some actually believe that if you deny that creation is 6 24-hour days, that the whole Bible falls apart. I don't see a basis for that. And I've heard most of the arguments, maybe all of the arguments for that. Others say, well, God couldn't create the universe in just 24-hour days. And my answer to that is God doesn't need any time at all to create everything. God could have just gone and everything was created. That's by definition, God has that power. So if God could have gone create everything and boom, it was all there, why did he choose to do it in 6 pieces over 6 days? And since God could do it with a snap of his finger or the word of his mouth and do it in an instant, there's a reason why he chose to do it in 6 days. And whether or not those days are 24-hour days then becomes really secondary to the issue. There's something else that God is telling us in putting it in 6 steps, 6 days, 6 eras. He's trying to tell us something deeper, more than simply, I created this. He's trying to tell us something about the order and the purpose of that creation. So that's part of what we want to explore today and in the next couple of episodes as well. So back to this idea of the 24-hour day. Why would I even suggest that a day might not be a 24-hour day? Am I just playing games with words? No. Many times the Bible uses the word day, like the day of the Lord, right? A lot of prophecies about the end times and the day of the Lord. Well, the day of the Lord is not a single day. It's going to be a long era that will include the millennium of 1,000 years, that will include the tribulation of 7 years. So the day of the Lord in the future to come is a day that lasts at least 1,007 years. Right? It means an era. We use the same phrasing today. Someday, or back in the day, or right. We don't mean 24 hours every time we use the word day. We don't do it now. We didn't do it then. The day of salvation is another phrase the Bible uses. And the day of salvation doesn't mean a 24-hour day. It means the moment. So a day of the Lord can mean something more than 1,000 years. The day of salvation can mean a moment much shorter than 24 hours. A day is simply one of those words, like most words, quite frankly, in the English language that have multiple uses. You've also got the infamous phrase in 2 Peter 3:8, in which he's actually quoting Psalm 90, verse 4, with the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day. That is not a mathematical equation. I've had too many good Christians go, oh, well, it's been 2,000 years since Jesus was here. That means it's only been 2 days. Therefore, if you add the days, no, that's not a mathematical equation. It's in a book of poetry. It's a metaphor. It just means that God is on a different schedule than we are. That's all it means. But it does give you an idea that the word day is used in different ways. Now, in addition to that, the days that we will see in this 5 days of creation, including the 6th day, is that will describe the day as evening and morning. And it was the 6th day, evening and morning, and it was the 3rd day, evening and morning, and it was the 1st day. Look at it and you'll see it there. Depending on your translation, it may use slightly different words, but it uses in that order, evening and morning. When you and I think of a day, do we think of evening then morning? Do we think of sundown and then sun up? No, we think of morning and evening. We think of getting up in the morning and that begins our day and the sundown ends it. We think of morning and evening as a day. But why is it phrased evening and morning? That's because the Jewish day always began at sundown, and so it began at evening and went through the morning to the next evening. So what is being described here is, by saying evening and morning, it's saying this is a theological explanation more than it is a scientific explanation. It's not anti-science. It's not unscientific. As we'll see in a bit, it actually matches science extraordinarily closely, but it's not designed, as we saw earlier, one of our foundational principles of this. We're not approaching Genesis as a science book. We're approaching it as a book of theology and a book of history. And this is a theological phrase. This is not a scientific phrase. Evening and morning to describe a day is a theological phrase and not a scientific phrase. So we have to look at it through theological eyes and not necessarily scientific eyes, although it's not going to deny science, because good theology, good science, right, are good friends. So this is more of a theological explanation than a scientific one. So in addition to this about the 24-hour day, and I know I'm taking some time on it, but it's so foundational to so much of what else we will believe about Scripture, and there's so much disagreement among good Christians about it, I think is worth taking the time on. In addition to that, the first chapter of Genesis is written in poetry. It's hard for us to see it because of the translation, because we're not familiar with Hebrew poetry. But I'm going to show it to you here if I can do it in a way that I can see it in my own camera. There's the first page of Genesis, obviously. Now I want to show you. And if you've got a physical Bible, you can see this. If you're reading a Bible online, that's fine. I read my Bible online all the time, but you probably won't see the choices for layout online like you will in a physical Bible. So that's why I'm going to show it to you in a physical Bible. Take a look. That's a typical. So that's Genesis what? Genesis 8 or so, right? That's how the Bible typically looks when it's written out in regular format. Let's flip it back. Do you see the difference there? It's subtle, but you see the little part where it sticks out. Here, here and here, right? The paragraph begins by sticking out rather than sticking in, but in regular prose, it begins with an indent. You see the difference? It's a subtle difference, but it's a difference in the way the page is laid out, right? Now, why is that page laid out differently? Because the translators and printers and publishers of Bibles lay it out differently for poetry than they do for prose, so that you can tell this is poetry. And this is a poem. Genesis 1 through, I think, 2, 3, or 2, 4 is a poem. That doesn't make it untrue, but it does mean, as we saw earlier, and I think our first episode in all of this, we read poetry different than we read history, differently than we read science, differently than we read biography, right? So this is a theology book. It is a history book, but it has points where things are expressed in poetry, which again tells us if your aim is to give, if your primary aim is to give the science behind something, you don't say evening and morning, which is a theological term, and you don't write it as poetry. They're trying to give us something else. Again, it's not anti-science. It's not unscientific. But the scientific method, it's not its primary purpose. It's trying to tell us something else. So that's what it's trying to tell us. That's a great mystery. That's a great conversational point. I'm just giving you the information so that you can add it to your understanding of this. I wouldn't want somebody to walk away and go, yeah, my pastor gave me this great breakdown of Genesis 1. And they go, did they tell you it was written in poetry? He goes, no. They go, well, then he's trying to hide something from you. I'm just exposing to you some of the key factors that we bring into it when we're trying to understand what Genesis 1 is telling us. So if this is 6 24-hour days, which I believe is a possibility, and if you're wondering where I land in the middle of, I'm not really sure. This is one of the big I don't knows for me. It is. I don't know where it lands. And quite frankly, what's more important is the order of creation, as we'll talk about it in a little bit, why that matters more than the actual 24-hour days. But here's kind of my theory of, if it was 6 24-hour days, how can that possibly be when we now have telescopes and we're sending out the Hubble that can literally look back and we know we're getting light from stars from billions of years ago. Right, we know that these are virtually undisputable scientific facts. There are certain things we can measure, and those are measurable. So if we're getting light from stars from billions of years ago, how could God have created the earth in 6 days? And then we only have a record in the Bible, the genealogy of the Bible that is about 6,000 years long. How can that possibly be? I don't again, I don't have a final answer for it, but here's my best attempt at how it might look. I want you to imagine that you are able to transport back in time to 5 minutes after Adam and Eve are created. 5 minutes after Adam and Eve are created, you're in the middle of the Garden of Eden, you look around, you see Adam and Eve. In your mind, how old would they look? Do you expect to see 2 5-minute-old infants lying on the ground? Of course not. You're going to look and you're going to see people that are going to, maybe in your head, they're somewhere in their 20s, maybe, that's the picture in my head. They're young, they're vibrant, they got a lot of baby making years ahead of them, right? That kind of a thing. Somewhere in their 20s probably is how they appear to be to your, even though it's 5 minutes after they were created. They're only 5 minutes old and they look like they're in their 20s. Now I want you to imagine that you go over to a full-grown tree and you chop it down. Will you see rings when you chop that tree down? My guess is yes. You're going to see saplings. You're going to see fully grown trees. You're going to look up in the sky and you're going to see stars that we know the light took billions of years to get here, but it's visible from Earth. Why? Because when God created, if he didn't do it over the span of billions of years of evolution, like evolutionary creationists believe, if he did actually do it in 6 24-hour days, which I believe is a possibility, then he would have to create things at various stages of their lifespan. You can't start everything from its infancy. 5 minutes after creation, everything can't be at 5 minute stage of birth. Everything would collapse. You can't have two infants laying on the ground with no one to care for them, right? You can't have only saplings or only seeds in the ground that have not yet sprouted, right? Everything, different things have to be at different stages of their lifespan in order for the balance to work. So everything from the light from stars to rings in trees to two adults standing there 5 minutes after they were created, right? That's how God would have to create it. So that is not him hiding anything. That is simply him giving us a sustainable creation that can work from that point forward. That's my idea. I didn't find it in a book anywhere. So if you think it's loony, then it's probably loony. But that's kind of, that's not a scientific or even a theological explanation. That's how I see it in my head. And now you have a look into the dangerous recesses of Karl Vaters' brain, which is probably a scary place to go. So is that a way of explaining it? Not really. It's kind of how I picture it in my head. And if you picture it somewhat the same way, you can look at it and go, oh, okay, that makes some sense to me. Anyway, let's get on from that to from these unexplainable things to the rest of the text, at least because I've already done probably about half of the time that I'm going to take on this episode, which, as you can tell, is probably going to go longer than usual. Although you know more than me, because by the time you're watching it, there's already a timestamp on it, and I don't know how long I'm going to go. Anyway, day 2. Let's take a look at day 2. Day 2, verses 6-8 say, "And God said, let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water." What's the vault? The sky. The water is above is the water in the clouds. The water below is the water in the oceans, right? So God made the vault, that's the sky, and separated the water under the vault from the water above it. And it was so. God called the vault, here we go, sky. And there was evening and there was morning. There's that phrase again, right? Evening and morning, the Jewish way of the Jewish theological way of assigning a day. There was evening and there was morning the second day. So the translation that I just read says sky. Almost all other translations, if you're following along, will use the word heavens. God called the vault sky. Most other translations say God called the vault the heavens. Why is that a different word here? Just like in English, in Hebrew, they had actually far fewer words than we have in English. And so every word had to do multiple duty. And the word heaven or heavens in Hebrew meant many things. It meant the sky just above your head. It meant space. It meant the place where God dwelt. There were probably about, you've heard the phrase seventh heaven. That's about how many different levels of locations that the Bible uses the word heaven to describe. So when the Bible says that Jesus ascension, he ascended into the heavens and the cloud received him. That does not mean he ascended into heaven as we understand it, the abiding place of God, but into the sky, because that's where the clouds are, right? So you've got the immediate sky above us, you've got the clouds, you've got the sky beyond the clouds, you've got space, you've got the heaven where God lives, right? Multiple things that are described as heaven. Because of that, and because we have different words for that, some of the newer translations will use a different word for that. So if you've got an older translation that says heavens, and I just read sky, it's simply a way that the new translations use to be able to describe that. So anyway, it's also another, for instance, when the Psalms say the heavens declare the glory of God, that typically means space, because it then talks about planets and stars and so on, right? So just an idea for that. So that's an aside. Let's get to the Q&A for this. First question for the question for day 2 is, why is every day called good except for day 2? Day 1, day 3, day 4, day 5, they're all called good, but day 2, there's no and it was good. Nobody really knows the answer to that. But the best answer to that we've got is that God's work with water starts on day 2, but it isn't complete until day 3. So it may be that this is like a half day of work done. It's not completed all the way. It's not a great answer, but it's about the best answer that most theologians can come up with. It's the only day in which it doesn't say, and it was good. Now, let's jump ahead now to day 3. Now we're moving along at a pace, aren't we? Day 3, beginning with verse 9. And God said, let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let the dry ground appear. And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and the gathered water he called seas. God saw that it was good. There's the good, right? Then God said, let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it according to their various kinds. And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seeds according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the third day. Now, this idea of land and seas separating brings us to a fascinating question that absolutely drives me crazy. So I'm going to deal with it. And it's this. Is there any biblical or scientific basis for the theory of Pangea? Now, if you haven't heard of the theory of Pangea, let me explain it to you really quickly. It's a really popular theory. A lot of people really, really like it because it looks kind of cool, I think is the only reason. Pangea. Gea means earth. Pan means the entire earth. So Pangea means one entire earth. And the idea of Pangea is, well, let's take a look at it here on a map. Okay. So here's the map and we'll show it to you. You've got the entire map of the world here, right? And people for centuries have noted that this angle here and this angle here are shockingly similar, right? This angle here, this angle here. So the question is, did this at one point fit into here? That's the question people have. And then this curve here is very similar to this curve here. So at some point, did these match in there? So that's where the thinking begins. And then we do know that the earth shifts. I live in California, right? This is for Cornerstone. We live in California. We know the earth shifts. We know the earth moves. So the question becomes, over a long, long, long period of time, were these at one point connected here and here to here and here to here? Were they at one point connected and they've drifted apart? And so people have come up with a theory called Pangea, or one earth. And here's a picture of what Pangea, in fact, this came up just this year, early 2020, somebody came up with this potential picture of Pangea at keeping the current borders. So here you've got this angle of South America going into that angle of Africa, and you see how very similar they are, right? And you've got the curve of Africa going into the interior curve of North America there, right? So you take a look at those and you see that and you go, oh, okay, I see where that's coming from. And then India matches up there and Greenland fits in there, right? It looks like, wow, that must be the way it is. And there's a lot of people looking at that and going, that's the way that must have happened. And I just look at it and go, no, that's nuts. And it's actually got nothing to do with theology. It has to do with basic understanding of the world and the earth and geology. And let me take a look at it for you here. Let me show you what I mean by that. We look at it and we think, okay, yeah, this here is similar to this here. And this curve here looks like it might fit into this curve here. And if these pieces of land were in fact floating on top of the water, that would make sense. But we know enough about geology to understand that the land is not floating on top of the oceans. It's all land. This here is land. This here is land. All of it is land. But some of it is just 2/3 of it is covered by water. It's all land. There's not. It's not like it's all water all the way down to the bottom, and this here floats on top of the ocean. Africa doesn't float on top of the ocean. North America doesn't float on top of the ocean. The ocean sits on top of land. That's indisputable. We just know that. You can go to the bottom of the ocean, and what will you find on the bottom of the ocean? You'll find land. Right? If you emptied out those oceans, in fact, one of the reasons I picked this particular globe is it shows you some of the land under the water. It's higher here, it's lower here, right? This is all land. You can see the different land breaks here. And if the water was less, these would be islands that come to the surface, right? Instead of being beneath being beneath the ocean, right? You can see these spots here where the base of the ocean is higher and where it's lower. This idea that somehow these all floated out even over billions of years doesn't make any sense at all. Yes, the earth shifts, But this here did not come out of this here. The amount of change, it wouldn't resemble these borders at all over if it happened over billions of years. So it's not even an evolutionary problem that I've got with it. It's not from a biblical standpoint. It's from a basic standpoint of the land doesn't float on top of the water. So Pangea makes no sense. And it amazes me how many people look at this as though it's got some scientific basis. It's not. It's kind of an interesting, fun little illustration, but any basis in reality is completely lost. So anyway, I just threw that out because it drives me crazy. So the answer to the idea of Pangea is no. While the land does move, the land does not float on water. So the idea of Pangea just doesn't hold water. See what I did there? It just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. All right, let's go to day 4. Sun, moon, and stars, including the planets. Beginning with verse 14. And God said, let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark sacred times and days and years. And let them be lights in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth. And it was so. God made 2 great lights, the greater light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set them in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the 4th day. So here's the question for day 4. How was there light, evening and morning, when there hasn't been a sun yet? Sun doesn't come up until today, but we've had evening and morning before this. This is, again, another one of the reasons why I don't believe that the days as mentioned are 24-hour days, because you have to have a sun in order for the days to be 24-hour days. The other potential answer to this, because the sun would have been created obviously before the water separated, there's a sun in the sky. Could this be the day in which, after all of the mayhem of creation and all of the dust that was raised and all of the water falling onto the earth, and however that happened, could this be the first day when enough of the sky cleared that you could actually see the sun clearly in the sky? You could see the moon at night and you could see the stars at night. That's my best case scenario of what this probably means. If it's literally this is when the sun was created, then it does not match what we obviously know how things did come about. And it's the only place in the narrative of the first 6 days of creation that doesn't match what we know scientifically, which we'll get into in a moment. So I think either this simply this is probably when we saw the sun and the moon for the first time after the sky cleared, after all of the kind of the construction dust of creation kind of settled. That's not a great answer. It's not a definitive answer. It's not a hill that I will die on. If you have a better answer, I await it, because I would like to have a better answer than that, but it's the best one I've got for now. So how is there? Here's how. Day 4 could be when the sun, the moon, and the stars became visible from Earth. That is a possibility. I think it's, this sits out there and I don't see it. It disappears on me, but it stays out there for you. So I'll keep it out of the way here for you. Try to remember that as best I can. So it could be that that's when it appears. But as I said before, the Bible sometimes leaves us with more questions than answers. This is one of those situations where I just simply have to go, I have questions on this. If good science and good theology are good friends, this is one place where they do not appear to be good friends. Therefore, either our understanding of science is off, or our understanding of theology is off, or maybe a little bit of both. And the best way I can reconcile them is this is maybe when the sun and the moon and the stars first became really visible from the earth, because the dust of creation had begun to settle. Now, again, not a great answer, but it's the best one I've got. I don't know. And as we've said before, saying I don't know is not the same as God saying God doesn't know. This is a true account of creation. We know that our understanding of it is limited, but it is a true account of creation. So how and why it does or doesn't match science is not a fault of God. It is a fault of our understanding of one or both. So anyway, that's why it's best to approach these passages with some degree of humility. It's a mistake, I think, to say we've figured out how Genesis 1 works. And I also think it's a mistake to toss it out as a fairy tale, because it doesn't appear to match what we know scientifically. Genesis 1 is too real for it to have been make-believe. And because of the subject matter, it's too mysterious for us to know for sure. So we need to take it seriously. We need to understand it better. We need to be better at our science as well. And the better we get at theology and the better we get at science, the better friends they will be. So, anyway, I told you we'd come back to that a lot. Now we go to day 5, our final day. And we're finally done with this hopefully interesting, but certainly complicated episode. This is the day that fish and birds come about. Chapter 1, verse 20. And God said, let the water teem with living creatures, and let birds above the earth fall across. Let birds fly above the earth across the vault of the sky. So God created the great creatures of the sea and every living thing with which water teems and that moves about in it, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them and said, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the water in the seas, and let the birds increase on the earth. And there was evening and there was morning, the 5th day. This is one of those spots, and especially now as we come to day 5, that shows that the biblical account of creation, really the good theology of the biblical account of creation really does match good science. For instance, we know scientifically in the way life came about on this earth that fish came before birds, then birds came before land animals. That is just simply the way life came about. And the Bible shows that they came first as well. So good science and good theology here show themselves to be very good friends. So that leads to the final question and answer that we'll look at, covering the first entire 5 days. And no, we have yet to get to higher land animals, including mankind. We'll see that in the next episode on day 6. How well do science and theology match up in the creation story? And here's what we'll just conclude with for today, because we've gone on long already. And where we'll go with this is this. All the major points agree. Minor things, the sun seems to be out of order and other things here and there, but these are fairly minor. All the major points agree. It begins with light. We then have the division of water and land. We then have plants. We then have lower animals, fish and birds. We then have higher animals, which we'll see in the next episode, with higher land animals, cows, and so on. And then finally with humans as the final point of creation. That matches how science knows life came about on the earth and in the universe itself. So while there are a lot of unanswered questions, and while there are a lot of places that we don't quite know how they match up yet, and while there's a lot of debate between good Christians and good scientists about this, there are no direct contradictions. And the basic main structure of it matches up with what we know scientifically. And here's the deal. One of the reasons I'm a Christian and not a Buddhist, not a Muslim, not a whatever else, there is simply no other religious or ancient account of creation that even bothers to come close to what we understand as a scientific explanation for it. Well, this is not primarily a science book. Let me reiterate that again. It is primarily a theology book. And this is written in a piece of poetry, again, with those caveats. It at least follows the timeline that makes sense scientifically. Other creation stories are about, Atlas holding up the earth on his shoulders and being on the back of a giant tortoise, and they're completely mythology. There's no attempt to actually give you a rational explanation for how these things came to be. The Bible, while primarily theology, does have scientific merit to it. The broad strokes of the creation story match the broad strokes of what we understand scientifically. And it's one of those things where I just look at it and go, wow, so many thousands of years ago, there's no way this many thousands of years ago when this was written that any human being had anything close to this understanding of the scientific understanding of how we got to where we are today. Most of this has been discovered within the last couple hundred years, let alone thousands of years ago. But God knew it all along because God did it. And so God, even through their limited understanding, and speaking to our limited understanding, gave us language where we can look at it today and go, well, from best we understand it, it really does match up. It's not just some crazy, once upon a time fairy tale thing. It has validity on the broad strokes, and where it doesn't seem to match up, that is a limit of our understanding and not of God's communication of it to us. So that finishes up day 5 today. Next time, we're going to get into day 6. higher animals being created, humans being created. And what we're going to concentrate on next week, and next week's will be much shorter, probably about 20 minutes or so. We're going to take a look at what it means to be created in the image of God, or what the old Latin term imago Dei. What does it mean for us to be created in the image of God, and the whole idea of male and female um, uh, superiority or equality, egalitarian or complementarian. We're going to get into that whole mix, male and female, and what it means to be that and still be made in the image of God. So that'll be the next episode. I hope I see you then. That one's going to be, if people didn't get mad at me on this one, they're going to get mad at me at the next one. That's for sure. All right. See you then.